Thank you for joining us for our exploration of Richard Nixon, one of the biggest problems, we can say, of the 1970s. He's the only president to have resigned, so obviously there's something there. So let's look at Nixon, both good and bad, and see what unfolds. So before we get to Richard Nixon as president, let's think about where he came from. Nixon is from California. During World War II, he served in the Navy. And he very quickly afterward becomes a congressman from California. When we talked about the 1950s and the look for communists in the government, Nixon was a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee. So that's where he really makes a name for himself. So much so that in 1950, he gets himself elected senator from California. Well, he goes on to then become the vice president for Eisenhower, who became president in 1952. So he'll serve for 8 years as Eisenhower's vice president. He will run in 1960 against John F. Kennedy for president, but lose. Fast forward 8 years later. Normally, when someone loses a run for the president, you're kind of outcast. You're seen as a has-been, or you won't really make it back to political prominence. Nixon, however, was an exception. So, 1968, we know Vietnam was very divisive. Johnson himself wasn't happy with how it was going, so much so that Johnson decided not to run for re-election. He announced that fairly late in 1968, and so that made Democrats scramble. They were divided between Eugene McCarthy and Bobby Kennedy, who were both peace candidates wanting to end Vietnam. And then another Democrat that was there was Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who was kind of saying, well, we'll change things a little bit, but kind of keep doing what we're doing. That really opened the door for Nixon to to become successful, because the Democrats themselves were divided. Nixon also took advantage of a group of people named the silent majority. If you think back about maybe people like they're out in the world, you see them and they're kind of silently judging people. And they're not going to say anything, but they're the ones like the side eye emoji, right? They're like, can't believe that's happening. This is who Nixon's going to appeal to. These are the people that maybe don't like the way Vietnam is going, but they don't like the protests. They don't like the hippies. They don't like these young people with new ways of doing things. That's who Nixon's going to appeal to in 1968. Nixon will win, but just barely, by 500,000 votes, which is 0.6% of the popular vote. Now, we know it's the Electoral College that really counts, right, that gets you elected president, but that just shows how tightly divided America was. The unique thing we notice during this time is that we see a third party candidate that actually won several states, and that's George Wallace, who is popular in the Deep South. Being in the Deep South, you can guess from previous lectures, the thing that they were most concerned about was segregation. So Wallace was a segregationist candidate. That was the biggest part of his platform, and you can see that in the states that he won in the South. So Nixon wins the states in the orange and becomes president. So we're going to talk about Nixon's foreign policy first. So Nixon is going to do something that no president had done before, and he's going to go visit China. China had been kind of blocked off from the U.S. since the Communist Revolution in 1949. And Nixon is going to say, well, you know what? They might be communists, they might be our political opponents, but some dialogue is a good thing. So he becomes the first president to go to China. He will follow that up with a visit to the Soviet Union. So there was exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States during this time period. In 1972, he goes to Moscow, and they were having famines. They were having a need for American grains. And so Nixon reaches a deal for American grains to be exported to the Soviet Union. Again, this idea, right, that talking to people who are your enemies, opening that conversation, and then having a commercial relationship can help to soften the political divide. There's a French word, détente, that refers to the relaxing of tension. So we see that here in this Time magazine article. They'll agree to limit nuclear weapons as well. So that's definitely progress. Some other things that would be a surprise to modern observers of politics, at least of the Republican Party, is that there are a lot of environmental protections that Nixon enacts. The parties have maybe flipped a little bit on this today, but back then, with bipartisan support, the Environmental Protection Act is passed. So we get the EPA, Clean Water, Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Act. So people were really thinking at the time, right, in the 60s and early 70s, we're creating lasting damage that can never be undone. If we lose these species, right, they're gone forever. Not surprising, based on what we saw before, but Nixon will win re-election in 1972, and he'll win by a much more comfortable margin. The Electoral College, this is a complete blowout over McGovern. But even in the popular vote, you can see 61% of Americans voted for Nixon. That's largely unheard of in the modern days. So Nixon comfortably rides into a second term in 1972. There is something different, though, about that. And maybe people would wish they would have had a do-over if they knew what was about to unfold. So as this is going on, there are a couple other events that you need to know about. One is the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were secret classified documents that were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg. And what it showed was that during the Vietnam War, or during Johnson's presidency, he was not being truthful about how the U.S. got into Vietnam. And he wasn't being truthful really with how it was going. So the Washington Post and New York Times, they published this, and Nixon doesn't want these published. And so kind of think about it for a second, right? Well, Johnson was the prior president. Johnson was a different political party, so why would Nixon care, right? Maybe he might actually be happy that these papers come out. But in reality, Nixon is going to think that, well, if the previous president lied about it, maybe people will assume that Nixon is lying about it too. So Nixon wants these papers stopped. He's not successful. They're published. Freedom of the press, right, allows these to be published. And Nixon has a group of people around him that are going to get up to some really shady activities. So first, besides the Pentagon Papers, there's also leaks coming out of the White House. They're annoying Nixon and his staff, so they get a group going, unofficially called the Plumbers, to stop the leaks. Get it? Plumbers, stop the leaks. So that's literally what they called them. But these plumbers also got up to some other illegal activities. And one thing they did was they wanted to discredit Daniel Ellsberg, the guy who published these classified documents or gave them to the press. So they break into his psychiatrist's office plans, and they kind of leak to the press that this guy Ellsberg is seen as a psychiatrist. This is before mental health was really talked about. So I guess they were hoping to discredit Ellsberg by saying that, oh, look, this guy sees a psychiatrist. Later on, it would come out that Nixon's advisors approved of the plan. But then people are going to start questioning, well, did Nixon approve as well? So there's our first shady thing that's happening. There's an even more shady thing that goes on at Watergate. Watergate will be the scandal, right, that will bring down Nixon. But Watergate was a office complex, a building complex in Washington, D.C. There were hotel rooms, offices, restaurants. It's just this big development in D.C. It was also where the Democratic National Committee had its headquarters. So, right, the Democratic headquarters are in this building. And there's a break-in at the Democratic headquarters before Nixon's reelection. It might set off alarm bells, right? Someone breaks into one of the party's headquarters right before the election. Sounds kind of sus, right? Well, the burglars are arrested. They're caught stealing documents, wiretapping phones, and at first there really is no apparent connection to Nixon. But people are starting to wonder, right? They're like, well, that looks kind of shady. We don't see anything, but you can see here in June of 1972, so what, 4 or so months before the election, people are already wondering if this somehow ties back to the White House. Like we saw in the electoral map, didn't matter enough Americans yet. Once Nixon's campaign, or once his second term gets underway, he has a huge problem with his vice president, Spiro T. Agnew. Agnew had been the Maryland governor before he was Nixon's vice president, and it was proven that Agnew took bribes as Maryland governor. Can't have that, right? It's illegal. That would also reflect badly on Nixon's White House. So Agnew resigns. And this sets up kind of a unique situation where the 25th Amendment, which had fairly recently been passed, is called upon. And what the 25th Amendment says is that when there is a vacancy in the presidency, of course, the vice president becomes president. We know that. But it hadn't been codified in all of American history until right before then. So that's kind of unique. But the other thing it says is, well, what happens if the vice president uh, dies, resigns, is removed from office? What if there's a vacancy with the vice president? And it says that the president can nominate a new vice president, and that person has to be confirmed by both houses of Congress. So that's kind of a unique way, right? They don't have an election nationwide for the vice president. They just say the president can nominate someone, both houses of Congress can pick someone, and they choose Gerald Ford of Michigan to be Nixon's new vice president. They go with Ford because he's well respected. Everybody likes him. Nobody thinks Ford is a suspicious guy, up to any kind of illegal activities. So Nixon goes with like the most clean cut guy to replace the vice president that, of course, had just been tainted by all of this scandal. Now, the unique thing about that, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but think about when Nixon resigns, who will become president? The vice president, Ford, right? What that means, though, is that Ford is the only person to have ever been president of the United States that was never directly elected by the people, right? He was never elected president. He was never even elected vice president. Yet, because of this interesting, right, set of circumstances, he'll. So back to the break-in, there is an investigation done by members of the press, which is interesting, newspaper writers. And what they find through secret informants is that Nixon knew about this break in. There's this interesting scenario where the informant, if he has material to give to the newspaper writers that day, he goes to one of their homes and they move a flower pot from one side of the porch to the other. That's the sign that, okay, secret meetup that night to hand over the information. And these guys start publishing these articles. And what they say is that Nixon knew about the investigation, that he was actively trying to cover it up, and that they were raising hush money to pay these burglars to be quiet inside of prison, right, as their question, so it doesn't get tied back to the president. The other thing that they allege is that Nixon was using the CIA, who usually deals with international spying, to interfere with the FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in. So this stuff, like, if you can imagine, right, this is not, maybe we're used to crazy political things happening today, but this stuff is freaking people out at the time. It never happened in American history before. So the Senate hears, they're reading about this, right? They read the newspapers too. The Senate starts their own investigation. Same deal. They hear that Nixon knew about it and they want to know more. The other thing they learn is that Nixon was so paranoid about stuff being used against him that he had secret recordings set up of White House interactions, meetings. So it's kind of interesting, right? You're going to record everything so you can stay safe, but if you're going to break the law, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you shouldn't record that, right? So the Senate says to Nixon, "We need to hear these tapes," and Nixon says, "No, they're top secret presidential material. Can't have them." The Senate goes to the Supreme Court and says, "We're doing this investigation. We need these tapes." And the Supreme Court rules that yes, Nixon needs to hand them over. So you have all three branches of government involved in this scandal. Nixon does hand over the tapes, but what they find is that a lot of them have these missing gaps in the middle of the recording, which is kind of interesting. Maybe if you think back, if you have audio cassettes or VHS tapes in your home, you know that it's possible to record over something. But it's kind of suspicious, right? That there's a beginning and an end to the tape, but the middle is blank. That like doesn't sound like something that accidentally happens. Forensic investigation also shows that in one of these tapes with an 18-minute gap, there are between like 5 and 9 different times where it's like somebody was listening, purposely recorded over, stopped, listened some more to see, right, if there's something there, purposely recorded over. That happened between 5 and 9 times. So this is all just huge news, right? They call these the smoking gun tapes. If you think about a murder mystery, the smoking gun shows that the gun was just fired, right, and killed someone. So things are not looking good for Nixon. We're going to take a quick listen to just a segment of one of these tapes with Nixon talking to one of his attorneys.
You on the money if you need the money. I mean, you get the money. Well, I think that's where. What I mean is, you can get $80 and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be done. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not easy, but it can be done.
For more information, please visit www.nixonlibrary.gov.
Okay, so Nixon is
The
there,
Nixon presidential,
and he's talking about hush money, and they know where the hush money can be gotten.
I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Yes, sir.
All right, so look at Nixon's combative stance there, his nonverbal cues. That clip is something that people, that in a psychology class, and when you're looking at nonverbal cues and trying to figure out if someone is lying or not, that thing just sets off red flags. It's still studied today as an example of somebody hiding something. Things are not looking good for Nixon. Ultimately, he finds out that the House of Representatives is about to impeach him. Now, there had been an impeachment before. Remember, to get impeached just means they're going to hold a trial. The House is voting to hold a trial, and the Senate will be the jury that decides if you're guilty or not. Nixon's like, "I'm not a crook. I have nothing to hide." Well, he finds out from his own political party that they're like, "Dude, you're not going to survive this. You're going to get impeached and you're going to be convicted and you're going to be removed from the presidency." So what do you do at that point? Well, like we said, Nixon is the only person that resigns, which begs a question. How do you resign as the president of the United States, right? What do you do? Who do you talk to? In this case, he gives his resignation letter. He just writes this really short resignation letter to the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. And that's it. So Nixon resigns. Vice President Ford, as he alluded to earlier, takes over. Nixon's an interesting guy. This is him on the way out of town. He's already resigned. He's going back to be a private citizen. And he's got the now he's a generation older. We see this, we think peace sign, but he's from the generation, the World War II generation, where it was V for victory. So he's got his victory fingers going when he just resigned. So perhaps Nixon was living in a land of an alternate reality. Who knows? The question that emerges, right, is what's going to happen next? Let's come back this way, actually, and look at this image right here. So Herb Bloch was a famous cartoonist, political cartoonist, definitely worth checking out. And the question comes, like, what comes next? We have a president who just likely committed crimes. He resigned. He could still be charged criminally. Just if you're impeached and removed from office, there's no jail time. That's just Congress saying, hey, you're done. So the question is, what happens next? And that's a debate that Ford will attempt to solve, but a lot of people don't really feel like it's solved at all. 30 plus government officials go to prison. Nixon does not. Ford decides to pardon Nixon of anything that he might have done. Ford says, our long national nightmare is over. Basically, Ford just wants to move past and get on with life for the United States. He thinks, well, how would that look to the rest of the world if we have a former president that's in jail? But not a very popular decision for Ford. Ford will run for re-election later on, but he won't get reelected. Too many Americans see him as connected to this. Even if Ford didn't know about it or have anything to do with it, they just see him as too tied to Nixon. So that's Richard Nixon. Domestically, had some successes, environmental successes, internationally, foreign policy successes by opening dialogue with communist countries that had been our enemies. But as the only president to resign, that definitely doesn't look too good on your resume. So thank you for watching. We will continue soon with another video. I appreciate it. This presentation was made by me. All rights are reserved. Thank you. Take care.